Welcome to ClickPoint, where we explore how this powerful combination transforms lives across industries like education, technology, venture capital, and sustainability. Today, we are speaking to Louka Parry, who is the CEO and founder of The Learning Future, an organization that supports schools, systems, and companies to thrive in tomorrow's world. A really interesting piece that we get into in this conversation is about the geographic isolation of Australia and how Louka used that as an opportunity to build a global community. Let's dig in. Okay, welcome to the inaugural episode of ClickPoint. And I am so excited. It's almost like I'm cheating to have a really good friend, a legend, dare I even say, a bit of a twin, Louka Parry, to join us for this episode. So Louka, I'm just going to dip right in because I know you so well, and I can go off onto tangents as you know I can. Let me ask you this initial question. The point of people coming on here is sort of talking about connection and connection with people, through technology, digitally, and otherwise. And so I'm going to start off by asking you, can you talk about how your personal journey influenced your approach to leveraging technology in the work that you do?
Wow, great question. Kwaku, it's great to be with you, my friend, for the inaugural. My personal journey has been, I would say, one deeply integrated with learning as almost a kind of personal expression. And so I grew up in South Australia in a lovely city called Adelaide. When I graduated high school, I moved to Europe for a year and a half. And that was the first, that's a rite of passage for many Australians. We are a long way from other parts of the world. And, that kind of experience of traveling across cities, countries, and cultures did a couple of things for me, Kwaku. One thing, of course, I started to realize just how vast this world is in which we live, in terms of geography, how complex it is as well, and also the beautiful diversity of it. And so I also became really conscious of my own background as a European, and my mother is Greek, my father is Welsh, with some Irish genes in there as well. And so I became really curious about my own history, and in some ways became a bit of a historian, a student of the world itself. And of course, to be able to do that, I'm a senior millennial, so I remember, Kwaku, what a modem used to sound like when you would log on at high school, and I remember signing up to ICQ and Messenger and connecting with friends. I remember getting my first mobile phone, the Nokia 3310, when I was in year 11 as a 17-year-old, playing Snake on the dot matrix screen. I mean, this is kind of my journey.
You're going deep Australian right now, but it is your personal
going journey. Real deep.
Deep Australian.
And so it kind of, that's when my interest really began with technology. I remember I saved up all of my money to buy a computer, and I bought a computer when I was 14 or so. I had it in my bedroom, and I would play some of those really old school games on floppy disks, and then I became, when I returned to Australia and chose to study education and arts and languages, I went out to a regional school, which again needed technology to connect with the rest of the world, and I became the ICT coordinator of that school. And so across my entire journey, technology has kind of been a medium through which I've been able to self-express, but more importantly, to learn. I did one of my master's degrees all online through correspondence at the University of New England, which is, the Australian version. So yeah, I mean, I just think, and now, of course, here we are talking across the Pacific, and we just take it as such a given. Technology has just been such an enabler for so much of my life, in terms of my own expansion, curiosity, certainly the travels that I've undertaken, and now the work that we do, also running a podcast and doing what I can to try to articulate the potential futures of education that we need. What does that mean for leadership? These are the kind of big questions that I continue to grapple with, Kwaku. But yeah, technology in particular has been ever since trying to fix computers at a school. It continues to be a dominant part of my journey.
I love that, and we're going to come back to the idea of the isolationism of being Australian and how that factors into your use of technology for a connection. I'm putting that in the parking lot. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. But I'm going to go a little techie here, because as you said, for those of you who might have missed it, maybe the accent, Louka is originally from Australia, lives in Australia, but he has a bit of he has a large global community that he maintains, that he shares with, that he learns from. And so along those lines, what specific tools, you can talk about maybe like your top 2 or 3, have you adopted that make you the most effective in connecting with people? So those things that you do, for instance, me personally, like a lot of my favorite tools, like my favorite tool at this point is Roam, which is something that you introduced me to. But in the work that you do, which spans all of these amazing things, and I know in the intro that people have heard, we sort of talk about a little bit about your bio and your intro, but what are your favorite tools that you think make you the most effective, digital tools, in connecting with people?
Yeah, I think there's a few low-hanging fruit there. Like, unsurprisingly, WhatsApp for my global community is really effective. Because of course of the international phone numbers. And so part of my work is in the social emotional learning space with a non-profit project called Karanga, Global Alliance for Social Emotional Learning and Life Skills. And we run a lot of our executive kind of back-end stuff through WhatsApp. It's also just accessible across the global south or the majority world also. And so when you think about global projects, that is just such an obvious one for me to put forward. The other way, I guess, is just podcasting platforms. One of my favorite tools actually is Apple Podcasts and Spotify, because they connect me into all the interesting conversations, and also I get to share kind of my unique perspective as well. And so I think those tools are really brilliant. Roam, I would add as well, as we are a remote first team at the Learning Future, and we have lots of wonderful consulting advisors and friends like yourself, Kwaku, and they're all over the world. So having a space where people can gather, which is it's virtual, obviously, but it has this kind of nice metaphorical office overlay, which I think is, a physical office overlay, which I kind of like. And then,
I'm gonna jump in on that really quickly. Being based in
yeah,
San Diego, there are times where you've given me an office in your room space, and I'll just come crash your meetings. I'll just poke my head in and meet some of the people you work with and contribute nothing, but just, when I say contribute nothing, really what I mean by that, you will be having a focused meeting and I'll just come in and want to say hi and see the people that you're interacting with and that you're doing amazing things with. And so I love that you introduced that to me.
Yeah, thanks, Clark. It's the incidental connections that we kind of have lost in remote first workplaces. And be you using Slack on the back end, or other tools we use is ClickUp, which is a social project-based management tool. That's how we run our funnel, our pipeline, all of our client management, CRM. So there's those kinds of tools too. But there is this idea of we're just going to wander over to someone's desk and say hi, knock on their door. It's a really lovely approach that I think Rome's now. Which I have no official affiliation with, by the way. But it's just, I think what we are
this
trying
podcast is not sponsored by Rome. We should just say that.
Because there is something, what is unique about analog and what is unique about virtual, and then how do we make the virtual more connective? Because it's no doubt we're all super connected, but of course, then we have on the flip side people feeling more lonely than they ever have before. as we know from the Surgeon General there in the United States, making that the main health issue of this moment. And so, yeah, I think the kind of tools that connect, and it's so interesting. I'm very pro technology because everything is a technology. All innovation is technology. But of course, I'm very hesitant when it comes to a subset of technologies. And I think, there's some really great, academics and writers that are doing some interesting work about the impact of certain technologies on mental health, especially from that social media space. And so it's kind of a really interesting moment to work out how does technology be the enabler for human-centered work, or even humanity-centered work, which I think is an even better framing, and ultimately maybe life-centric work, education, economics, even, which is what we're going to need to do. As you and I both know, having been at the UN this year, there's a lot of work to do to move our world, not in just to sustainability, but beyond it towards this regenerative understanding. So,
Okay. So, all right. Earlier, I posed this question about the isolationism of Australia, and I'm probably going to cheat a little bit, but you and I met right before the pandemic. I personally think that you might have been patient 4, not patient 0, but patient 4 of the pandemic. But despite that, I was still like, hey, come meet my family. And so this next question, like as I was looking at it, I felt like it was like it's a softball for you, because the question is, how do you reconcile the relationship between using tech and maintaining human connection? Now, for me, this is a softball because when people are like, "Oh, you know this guy from Australia? That's weird. You're really good friends." And as I reflect on it, you're one of the people I spoke to the most during the pandemic. We'd have these scheduled chats where we chat for like 3 hours at a clip, and sort of, we all had our little escapes during the pandemic. Like we had our hobbies or the relationships that we either developed or cut loose or whatever. And it's astounding to me that, one, I've never been to Australia. I haven't been there yet. It's an unfair relationship because I'm always trying to get you to come here. But that you were one of the people I spoke to the most, even though you live so far away. So, selfishly, I almost don't see a distinction between the two in the way that I was able to have that with you. But now that we're out of it, and even before it, my question for you, because you're this person who is so who is so focused on connecting with people in general, and and being in the same space with you is definitely different than us doing this, and you and I do versions of this all the time. So how do you reconcile the relationship between using tech and maintaining human connection?
Well, for me, it's kind of the intentionality between the use of any tool is what matters most. I wouldn't say like the level of conscious choosing imbued in that decision. And this is why one of my mantras is you run your tech or it runs you. And so
Love that.
It's incredible, right? Well, it's kind of like an extension of one of my favorite quotes from Carl Jung, which is, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And that insight, and with what we do, anything we do in life, is actually, am I choosing this fully, as with the best of my ability, with the knowledge and skills that I have right now? And if the answer to that is yes, then that, in my view, is being fully alive. It's living well. It's educating well. It's learning well. It's leading well. Absolutely. And yet, of course, we know so much from the behavioral sciences now about heuristics and these shortcuts that our brain uses to effectively save energy. And of course, that means we are quite programmable in some regards, as we know from, the dopamine system in particular. So I guess for me, technology it's not just a no-brainer, it's an essential tool. And yet it's how do I use it to connect, not to consume. Like if we had like consumption, connection, and creation, maybe as like a model, Kwaku, my view is, we should be pushing to high levels of creation, high levels of connection, and actually low levels of consumption. And yet what many of us do, sometimes delightfully in ways, is just consume through technology. And it's not real connection. Kwaku, during the pandemic, I mean, many of us, and I also did this, watched lots of television, lots of series. I watched Peaky Blinders. It was brilliant. And I was consuming it and I had a great time. And yet, if it's too unbalanced between consumption, connection, and creation, we end up, I think, regretting the time that we spent when we as we advance through our life, saying, oh, well, I could have actually spent 3 hours talking to a dear friend across the Pacific about life and adventure and love and whatever else. But no, I spent 3 hours just watching reels or something,
Right.
So I guess that's my main reflection on this, is that as an Australian, technology here is essential to connect yourself with the world. Otherwise, we are an isolated island down south in the world. Of course, Asia Pacific is playing down under, as we'd say in Australia. Here down under, but we invented Wi-Fi, our national scientific body. So there's kind of like, we've been an innovation nation for a long time because of the distance. And so now there's quite a lot of innovative practices taking place in Australia, in some ways because they're must-haves. They're not must-have. You can't just walk down the street and be in the middle of Silicon Valley.
Or take a short plane ride and be,
it's a short 15-hour plane ride across the Pacific in our case. Which I've done many times.
Several.
And then again, and the last thing I'd say is that we are a vast country. We are just smaller than the United States, with a population of 27 million or something, as opposed to 360 or whatever the case might be in the US now. And so for many regional communities, to be able to connect is just absolutely critical, with even regional centers or with the big cities. And 90% of our population lives on the coastline. I think it's this is a metric system. I think it's 2 people per square kilometer across Australia. It is very sparse because a lot of it is the outback. It's arid, it's beautiful. In large distances, technology has always been a crucial way of getting things done. And that includes at local and also global levels for someone like me.
So I love and at the risk of over flattering you, like the Yuval Harari sort of take on where this innovation comes from around connecting with people as a necessity, not just like, oh, well, this would be cool if we had this. And so the idea that the thing that you mentioned, you were talking about consumption, connection, and creation. How do you scale that within communities? Because a big part of your work is going into different communities. Some of these communities are, I'm going to do air quotes, local to you in Australia, because you said it's a vast country. But some of these communities involve some of the work you do in Salzburg, some of the work you do here in the States. How do you create conditions for more creation and connection over consumption? And is that something that there's a level of it that you have to do with technology just because of the distance. But if you were to compare those two, like you being in a room, and I've presented with you, you being in a room.
That was great. We've got South by coming up next year.
South by, so we've presentations coming up. How do you do that in person versus doing that digitally? And how do you, especially with the digital piece, how do you cultivate or create the conditions so that people do feel safe enough, inspired enough, so they'll choose to connect and create over just consuming?
Really interesting question. I think in terms of the conditions for this, a lot of it is, in my view, and I like this framing, it's remembering agency, like remembered agency. Remember, you are a creator in the world, as opposed to the opposite, which is learned helplessness, which again, there's a whole bunch of research that's been done on that, particularly by Martin Seligman. And so the whole idea is like, remember, you are a creator every single day. we're imbued with consciousness, and there's a whole interesting debate about free will going on in some, deeply intellectual circles at the moment. And even the consciousness debate, is it an epiphenomenon of materiality, or is it there's something else playing out? The whole point is you have the ability to choose. And it's when we create conditions that elevate our awareness of choices that we are then able to be more creative in the world, is my view. When that's de-elevated, absent, or in particular, or even discouraged, which we know from some dictatorial regimes in the world, and you can do this at scale with, even things like social contagion and mass psychosis. You can try to have a very docile population that really just consume. I mean, and the great fictional example of this is 1984 by George Orwell, with doublespeak and the idea of those who control the past control the future, those who control the present, control the past. And so there's this interesting, I think, dynamic where, and our work in education ecosystems or even in workplaces is create conditions where people feel highly agentic. They feel they have the right amount of psychological safety to choose well, create good choices. And, there should always be a spectrum of course. You can't control people. That doesn't work. So allowing there to be a kind of range of choice in any context, be that in a learning context, in the classroom, be that for educators themselves, one where people feel like they're in command and control of their life. And then the other piece around connectedness is the best organizations have very high levels of belonging and social connectedness. People feel like they're doing things together. It's not just a disparate group of random people kind of operating, or it's not everyone too tightly, not being able to be authentic. It's this idea that people understand their uniqueness in terms of their skill set and their mindset, and they're able to contribute powerfully. And so if you can elevate those aspects in work, life, and also in schools and universities, then we're getting somewhere, and people are more likely to create rather than consume. Consumption in some ways, and I spoke recently with Professor Mark Brackett from Yale, again, and he's a wonderful emotion scientist. So many of us are just resisting our uncomfortable emotions, including me and you, because we're still human. And so what do? We often seek pleasure, or we seek escapism, which so often is what the consumption wheel can provide. Even things like the autoplay, these functions that were created as psychological devices to keep us hooked, or steal our focus, as Johann Hari would put in his book. That's kind of what we need to be conscious of. And it's not to say we don't want to watch a fantastic series that's been created on Netflix or Disney or whatever. It's just to say, with the time that I'm given and almost gifted, how might I spend it well? And then forgive yourself when invariably you get stuck kind of consuming too much. I mean, everybody, Kwaku, just to finish up this answer, when I speak to people around the world, it's kind of universal. People would say, I wish I learned a language. I wish I learned an instrument. I'm working on a book. All these things, So what I'm realizing more and more in my own life, because this plays out for me too, is feel the fear, but act through it and overcome the resistance, the part X. That part of you that is constantly trying to say, oh, you're not. What you create isn't good enough. This is the war of art. And ultimately, do your work, step back. And I mean, I'm paraphrasing so many different great books at the moment.
No, which is fine. And it's even what you're saying. I had this moment recently. Like you and I have talked about this for years. I played music with bands and stuff like that. And I had this moment where I was talking with someone about this, where I would really be into a band. They'd come out with an album, and I love the album. And then they'd come out with another album, and I would be invariably disappointed because I wanted like an extension of the thing that I already loved. And then when I fast forward 5, 10, 15 years, and then I listen to that album that disappointed me, I'm like, oh, I didn't get it at the time, but they were progressing with what they were creating. and I wasn't ready to hear it. And so when you're talking about this idea of creating and feeling that it's not good enough, and I'm very guilty of this, being like, all right, that's good, but or this sounds right, or this reads well, but, and it's always very easy to poke the holes in that. And you've opened up something for me, because I hadn't really thought of, even when I asked the question, creation as a form of connecting. And the idea of, hey, I'm sharing this thing, even though I don't feel that it's 100%, it is where I'm at as a person. And it is actually a pathway, even like the whole concept of this podcast. It's, some people like you are going to be people I've known for years, that I have tremendous respect for, that I'm already connected to. And other people that are going to come on here are people that I don't know at all. And it's about using this medium, this creative medium, to find a way to connect with them as humans. I love that you just opened that up for me. And so on this path, I keep peppering you with questions, but it's just like, I love it when you have a friend where you're like, God, I talked to them and we went someplace, and you and I know that you love to drop in like this. So I'm right here with you. All right. What things have you noticed, specifically human things, that you do that have made you successful in connecting with people? And this is a really, I'm gonna give you time to think about this as I sort of talk through my process. It's something that I haven't even noticed, but our friend Christy pointed out to me. She's like, you find the moment of commonality and then you lean into it. That's something that I'm not even conscious of it. Really, it's sort of like, in my head, there's like, God, there's all this awkwardness. Let's find common ground so that we're not being awkward together, even though it doesn't feel that way to anyone else in the room. But I am looking for commonality, and then I'll ask questions similar to what I'm doing now, even though I already know what our commonalities are, or at least I have enough of them. You always come through with new ones. But for you, when you think about how you connect with people, and all right, I'll add this little tidbit, and I tell people this all the time. When I first met you, I did not like you. I know I've told this story so many times. I was just like, oh my God, this guy, he's smart, he's got an accent, he's good looking, he's quoting books. I do not like this person. And it was just like in 2 minutes of you walking in the room, right? And so then we were paired up in this activity. And so like the first impression I had was like, oh God, I'm going to be stuck with this guy all week. And then you and I were paired up in an activity. And then in 5 minutes, I was like, nope, I'm completely wrong. This guy is brilliant. And he represents like all of these things that I've had inklings of, but I have never really fully understood how someone could embody them and yet still be so approachable. To be eloquent, to be intelligent, to be personable, and not be an ass. It's like, how is this guy doing this? No, this guy's and then like, fast forward a day and I'm like, hey, can I name one of my kids after you? No, it wasn't that bad. So the kids already had names at that point. But to that point, and I'm sure you weren't conscious of whatever you were just being you in that moment. But if you can reflect on it, what are the things that you do that you feel that have made you successful in connecting with people? And this is just away from technology, just in general.
Well, I also, Kwaku, I want to ask you a question. What is it?
Is that how this works?
Yeah. Because it also is kind of my answer. Okay. What is it that happened from your initial perception, all those years ago at the D school to shift your initial perception?
It was your vulnerability.
So that's a great thing to notice.
It was I feel typically if people are in social settings, especially something, you mentioned it was the D school, and so it's kind of intimidating because it's Stanford and you're expecting everybody around you to be brilliant and to, go to the men's room and come back out with a computer program or an app or something, and so it's like one of these scenarios where it's very human to sort of steal up and be like, this is why I deserve to be here. And you were vulnerable without being self-deprecating. I like to be self-deprecating as part of my vulnerability because it mixes in with humor. But you were just vulnerable, but still you. And I was like, oh, this is really intriguing. But that's, how you related to me. I don't know if this is what you get when you connect with other people.
Well, I think you've hit on something that's really powerful, and it's something I fundamentally believe, which is that we are all irreducibly unique. And so the journey for us is to understand ourselves at such a deep level where the kind of self fragility that is a very common part of the ego uh, doesn't drive our external expression. And so it's to feel kind of connected to that sense of who we are, the source, the core, whatever we might call it, the spirit. And then when you walk into a space, it means that you actually don't need to change. You can express your authenticity powerfully. And
Yeah.
it is a incredible compliment that I get is when people say like, oh, you're very yourself, or you seem so self-assured. I mean, I still have all the same challenges everyone else has, but there's something about understanding that fact of uniqueness. I am like very myself. And so, and I've been through the waves of trying to be other people. I'm kind of like in my late
I can't
30s now.
even picture that. I can't
Yeah,
even.
I mean,
I'm like,
oh
I'm trying to
no.
picture like cowboy Luca. I
Oh,
know
you did all
b-boy
that.
Luca was a
B-boy,
thing.
look, that was the whole
You
thing.
know what I mean? But
Yeah. I've had many selves, and this idea of what women like, we are Walt Whitman, we are legion, we contain multitudes. There's this powerful sense of actually the multidimensionality of self, which means you can be fully yourself. And then there's kind of more tactical things that I've learned, Kwaku, that, I do because I'm genuinely interested. Showing genuine curiosity, oh, mate, if only we could listen better to each other, the world would be a different place. And so, you want to be an interesting person, be an interested person. That is just a beautiful truism that I've really taken that and run with it and asked good questions that aren't surface questions. They're deep questions. They're not surface self, they're deep self. And I learned a lot of this from the School of Life and the emotional intelligence and emotional education spaces, from Alain de Botton, who's a wonderful contemporary philosopher. This kind of stuff really matters. Because how do you get to know somebody? We ask them a real question. And you go, like, you went on holiday with the family. That's great. I could say, where did you go? Right? Or I could say, like, oh, what did you notice the most about the family dynamic? Those two questions are really different because one of them holds us bravely at the surface, sarcastically, and the other drops us into real human connection. And I will say something, Kwaku. We are dying for real human connection in our world today. We are
preach.
starving for it. And
Yeah.
yet what we're getting is this surface level orientation where we all have this external self that is so distant from who we really are. And then everyone has this internal battle and they eventually feel quite unhappy, if not fragmented completely. Instead of I'm authentic, I am who I am, and not everyone will like me, which is a journey that I've had to go on as someone that is kind of quite agreeable. How do I be more disagreeable and stand in what I truly believe? That's a journey that continues. But when I think we do that, that's when we have this radiance of being alive. Maybe it's called aliveness, whatever we might frame it as. And I see you as a person like this, Kwaku, and I see some of our wonderful US colleagues as well. They are just fully themselves. Many of the great leaders in education are this because they're not just talking about human growth, they represent, they embody the fact that we're alive. And that means learning is abundant. Actually, lots of things are abundant rather than scarce. And so they come from a different mindset and orientation. So that's kind of my reflection on, I guess, this great opportunity that we have with the poly crisis and the fragmentation of society into different camps of blue and red in the United States context right now, for example. How do we really connect and ask someone a question rather than shouting at each other? Let's just stop and listen and do what First Nations have done really well here in Australia, where I've spent many years as an educator in community, is to sit in a circle, ask a great question, and see where that generative space takes us. That to me feels like a time well spent.
Excellent use of the term generative space as well. I really so oh man, there's so much time. You're giving me so many extra questions now, but I know we're running low on time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to go into like a speed round
Oh, great.
of questions because we got to mix it up. We got to mix it up.
I like that.
We'll end with a speed round, and it will be it'll be connected to AI and that concept of connecting and the positives and the negatives that come from that. So the last, I guess, long form I will ask you will be the following. Everything that you described, the idea of being present and being comfortable. When I first met you, you were the Learning Future, which is your organization, and the Learning Future was you. You know, you were the sole proprietor, you were the practitioner, in ways this is me with what I do with my organization as well at this point. And since then, you've scaled, you've grown, you have amazing people on your team. Annie Knock,
And not, yeah.
Ann Knock. Who else am I missing here? Yeah, Amy. What's Amy's last name again?
Fabry.
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
who else? Who else? Give me one more name because you.
Didn't.
Yep.
Well, Stephen Harris. He consults in for us as well. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So you have these amazing people. You have these amazing people, and I see how your organization has grown and how you support them. Now, as a leader of this organization, of practitioners of curiosity and learning, how are you helping to cultivate that comfort of self, what you've described about who you are, the ability to ask those questions? How are you cultivating that amongst your team? Because I've spoken to several people on your team, and they're fantastic.
Yeah.
And I see you celebrating them online and in person. How are you creating the space as a leader of this organization to continue to extend what you do personally throughout the other people that you have the privilege of working with?
Another great question, Kwaku. My goal as a leader is to enable everyone to express their selfhood in a way that creates value, like kind of full stop. And so one thing I am really keen on is supporting other people to feel like they are doing their best work in a unique way. And honestly, like, even though we're a private organization, we don't often think in the sphere of competition. What we want to do is be the most uniquely us. And so for that to work, we have to do that at every level of the fractal of the living system, which is an organization. So we're not mechanistic at all. We're quite organic in our view. And I'm sure, if you talk to my colleagues, they would say lovely things about me, but I'm sure there'd be some criticisms of probably too permissive. I wouldn't say
but that's also human. That's actually the sign. That's a sign of being a good leader. If they're comfortable enough to be able to express that in a way that's constructive to you and to other people, because it's the, I was just listening to this whole Adam Grant podcast. It's like the dangers of being too charming or something like that. I'll send it to you later. But the idea of being able to express a dissenting opinion is a sign of empowerment.
Absolutely. And the only way that happens is when people feel like they are seen and heard as their authentic selves, so that then they can put their position forward. And I think we are quite good at doing that. And I am quite good at doing that. Because I am genuinely curious in the experiences of others. It's the most fascinating thing, the world behind our eye. What a fascinating place, especially when they come into human dynamics of organizations, families, relationships. All of that then gets played out in these spaces. And so we're having a really great time. The other quick thing I would say, Kwaku, is at no point have I been the learning future. And it's an important distinction, because
say more. Even
when I first started, I have my own digital presence of loukaparry.com, I guess. And then we have the learningfuture.com. And then, I founded other projects. And the whole idea of doing that was to resist the temptation that sometimes come from people in the thought leadership space to be the human as your brand. And the only problem I have with that is that I think you can calcify as something, and you effectively stop potentially growing in particular ways, or you're known as your commercial front. And I actually am a human being that's multidimensional and always growing and learning and failing and all those things. And so separating them out for me was really important. And, the learning future is the current vehicle of expression, curiosity, and contribution to the education space. And that's going to be the case for quite a few more years, I expect. But then there'll be other forms of expression. And so enabling the agility to continually create, I think, is the focus here. And that's at the organizational level, but that's the same at the employee or the team member level, is that how do we continually create value for what's needed? And then when you create value, then of course you can have commercial success and you can have social impact. It's the focus on the creation of value. And again, it's the creation part, which connects back to our earlier conversation. If we're consuming too much, you read every person's book ever written, you never write your own. You listen to every other person's podcast, you never create your own. It's like move into this comfort of creation energy, and keep going. And I think if you do that, you'll be successful ultimately. And you'll probably look back on your life saying, wow, I gave it a real shot as well, which is a powerful, retrospective to have.
I love that. Okay. All right. We could probably, and we have done this where we did like a super long, like hour and a half conversation. I'm not going to do that with you today, at least not for this podcast. I'll probably call you later and we'll continue talking. All right. So this is how this is going to work. This is the first time I'm trying this. I'm going to give you a question, and I need you to answer it in like 15 seconds or less. So it's like short answers, but whatever comes to mind. All right. So I got a couple of these coming at you. You ready? But the trick is they're like actually hard to answer quickly. So I'm purposely trying to mess you up. All right. As long as we're on the same page. All right. How does artificial intelligence need humans to run effectively? And I will couch that as far as the idea of being able to connect with people. How does artificial intelligence need humans to run effectively, especially when being used in the process of connection?
Well, with machines learning, we need humans discerning. What intentionality are we imbuing into these particular AI tools is the question. And so discernment, welcome to the era of discernment, where humans can discern how these tools are used to either become more human-centered and more humanized, or even dehumanized. And we're seeing both use cases take place at the moment. So humans discerning the use of AIs is clearly what is taking place and what's needed.
Great answer. All right. You ready? What are the ethical implications of leveraging AI to build connections at scale? And so examples of this can be, you're on LinkedIn and it's just like, oh, similar people to this are X. And you see, maybe you're checking in on someone and like, oh, I don't know this person, but I'm just going to connect with them. What are the implications of doing this at scale? Or even if you're using your imagination, you're not even making those choices. These people are just being connected with you through AI.
Potential downside is that we lose our capacity to connect properly and authentically. So authenticity is one of the significant risks at the moment, where we're flooded by synthetic data, synthetic reach outs, synthetic everything. And so how do we maintain authenticity and use AI to augment, not automate, some of those deep human processes? It should, by the way, automate a range of different activities that are drudgery at work and give us productivity gains. But we shouldn't use it, in my view, for the things that make us the most human. We should, in some ways, cordon off that particular space and allow it as an augmentation device as a catalyst, but not actually as a, because it's not real at some point unless it's being driven. Like some of those deeply human things aren't real. They can be synthesized, but I don't think that is what we truly want as human beings.
All right, I got two more for you. You still with me? You're working hard to keep your answers short. I see that. I see that. You're really focused on this. All right. And I'm not asking you easy questions either. These are not yes or no questions. How do you build and maintain relationships in a predominantly digital world? Specifically you, where it's sort of like, I'm not talking about your local relationships. I'm talking about all of your relationships. And it's not even that Australia is small. How do you build and maintain relationships in a predominantly digital world?
I think, don't want to sound too ethereal, but like follow the energy and find the others. Find the sparks that resonate with what you're trying to build, who you're trying to be. And then, of course, like anything, keep watering that relationship as an organic feature. So checking in authentically, asking good questions, voice memos, tangibly. I use them all the time.
You're so good at that.
Well, it's more human as opposed to what, and of course I could synthesize my voice and get an AI to send it, but what's the point of that? And that's your former question. So yeah, I think just always, and again, deep self. We haven't got time with all these just huge networks. Don't spend time doing the surface stuff. Get down to the really good stuff of what life is, what's real, self-truth, and all those wonderful things.
That is great. All right. This last one, I'll let you stretch your legs a little bit. Last question. Can you share an example of a digital connection that led to a significant in-person collaboration? So, well, yes. Okay, go ahead.
And it's actually our director of strategy and culture and our director of learning environments, Dr. Ann Nock, because I was connected to her digitally, and a few people said we had to meet for years, actually, and Dr. Stephen Harris, friend, colleague, collaborator of ours, he finally connected us. We had a bit of a chat, and then we met at a conference in Adelaide. It was the first conference after COVID, actually. And we just clearly saw eye to eye. And she became the first hire of the Learning Future as we started to turn into an actual business organization instead of a thought leadership practice. So that was wonderful, because now here we are traveling Australia and the world together. She's in India at the moment, keynoting a conference after leading our European Vision Tour the week before. And yeah, we have just a wonderful relationship, and she's doing excellent work. And so I'm very grateful for the role of technology in helping that catalyze. That wouldn't have happened otherwise.
And that, I can't think of a better way for us to end this conversation together, not our time, but just this conversation. I want to thank you for a variety of things, but primarily for being the first guest on this fledgling podcast, and for being authentically and consistently you in any setting, which you've sort of explained, like the impetus for that and where that comes from. And yeah, that's it. Are there anything, actually, before we like close this out, if people want to follow your work, people want to learn more about what you're doing, want to maybe connect with you digitally and turn it into a meaningful in-person connection, what is the best way for someone to do that?
I'll give them 3 ways to do that. LinkedIn. I'm quite active on LinkedIn, sharing kind of knowledge, insights, and some of our work, what we're discovering around the future of learning and leadership. And so you just have to find my name, which is Louka Parry. And it's one of the best and worst things about having that name, Kwaku. It's so unique and uniquely me, but I have to spell it every time.
What's that like? I've no idea what you're...
No, well, I'm glad you've got such a common name as well in your California context. In Ghana, it'd be much.
Right.
So On LinkedIn is great. Otherwise, check out thelearningfuture.com or the Learning Future podcast with me. There's some wonderful global conversations on that, including one with you, Kwaku. And then otherwise, just send us an email, hello@thelearningfuture.com, and would love to know what you're working on. And again, how we can co-create value, which is something that I am on mission to do while I'm alive, while I'm doing this work.
Bro, thank you. That's amazing. We're going to include all those links in the podcast feed so people can click on those and go directly to that. And if you're listening, thank you for checking out this first episode. There will be many more. And also, as Louka mentioned, make sure you check out the Learning Future podcast. That's it for us today. Thank you guys very much. And we'll see you soon.